You're my father. Well, what did you say? Daniel Harrington's voice shook before he could control it. The words echoed through the microphones and across the vast conference room. That can't be right. He continued quickly, blinking as if trying to wake himself from a strange dream. You must be mistaken. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO sounded uncertain. Rows of investors froze in their seats. Financial reporters stopped typing. Camera shutters continued firing, capturing every second of the moment that had just derailed one of the most anticipated press conferences of the year. Daniel stood behind the podium beneath the towering glass wall of Harrington Tech's headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. Behind him, a massive digital screen still displayed the title of the event, announcing a revolutionary cybersecurity AI platform that analysts predicted would transform the industry. But no one in the room was looking at the screen anymore. They were looking at the little girl standing near the stage, and she was staring straight at Daniel Harrington. You're my father, she said again, calmly. A wave of whispers swept through the audience. Daniel tried to steady himself. I'm sorry, he said carefully, forcing a professional tone into his voice. But that isn't possible. He gestured lightly, attempting to diffuse the situation. I don't have children. A few nervous laughs drifted through the room. Daniel continued, trying to regain control. In my line of work, I've seen a lot of unusual situations. People sometimes make claims like this for attention, or because someone told them a story that isn't true. He gave a polite shrug. I've had people try to say I'm their father before. He looked down at the girl gently, but that doesn't make it real. The little girl didn't step back. She didn't look confused. Instead, she spoke quietly. My name is Annie. The room fell silent again. My mom's name is Maya Johnson. The name struck Daniel like a sudden gust of cold air. He didn't move. For a moment, he simply stared at her. Annie continued speaking as if she were explaining something simple. My mom said you used to be very kind. Daniel felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Annie slipped one strap of her backpack off her shoulder. She didn't tell me you were my dad, Annie said. She just cried. The reporters leaned forward. Daniel felt something shift in the room. Every night, Annie continued softly, my mom takes a picture out from under her pillow. Her small hands moved slowly as she spoke, as if replaying the memory. She looks at it for a long time. The room had become so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. And sometimes she cries, Annie added. Daniel felt something heavy settle in his chest. Annie reached into her backpack. I saw the picture one night, she said. Her fingers pulled out a clear plastic sleeve. Inside was a photograph. Old, the corners bent slightly from years of being handled. Annie walked closer to the stage. Security guards shifted uneasily. Daniel lifted a hand without looking away from her. Let her come. The girl stepped forward and held the photograph up toward him. My mom keeps it under her pillow, Annie explained. She says it reminds her that people can be good. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at the photograph, and suddenly the world seemed to tilt. There he was, younger, standing beside a woman with warm brown skin and bright, hopeful eyes. Maya. They stood outside a small diner somewhere in Brooklyn. Daniel remembered the night immediately. It had been raining. They had stayed inside the diner drinking cheap coffee until nearly 3 in the morning, talking about everything: his startup, her dreams, the future that seemed wide open. His arm was around her shoulders. They were laughing in the photo, the kind of laugh people have when they believe life is just beginning. Annie turned the photograph over. Look. Daniel's eyes dropped to the back. Black marker. His handwriting. For Maya, the only person who made me believe in miracles. Daniel Harrington. Daniel gripped the edge of the podium. His knuckles turned pale. The conference room had gone completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped whispering. Because now this wasn't just an interruption. This was a revelation. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes to Annie again. For the first time, he studied her face carefully. The shape of her brow, the stubborn tilt of her chin, something painfully familiar in the way she held her ground. My mom said you wrote that, Annie said quietly. Daniel felt the past pressing against the present like a door forced open after years of being locked. 6 years ago, he had walked away from Maya Johnson. Walked away because his family had demanded it. Because his future was supposed to be bigger than a relationship that didn't fit their world. He had convinced himself it was the right choice. Necessary. Temporary. He never imagined he would see Maya again. And he certainly never imagined this. Daniel looked down at the small girl standing before him. The investors, the cameras, the glowing Manhattan skyline beyond the glass walls. Everything in his life had been built on careful control, but control was slipping away now, because a 6-year-old girl with a worn photograph had just stepped into his world and reopened a past he believed had been buried forever. Annie's voice came again, small but steady. "My mom still says you were kind." Daniel swallowed. He looked again at the photograph in the plastic sleeve. The younger version of himself stared back with careless confidence, his arm wrapped around Maya's shoulders as if the world had no rules yet. For a long moment, Daniel didn't speak. The building outside the conference room continued its usual rhythm, elevators humming, voices echoing faintly down the hallway, distant keyboards tapping, but inside the room the air felt strangely still. Annie shifted her weight slightly. "Are you really him?" she asked. Daniel opened his mouth. Before he could answer, the hallway erupted with hurried footsteps. A woman's voice echoed sharply. "Annie!" The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. Annie's head snapped toward the door. "Mama!" Daniel turned instinctively. The door burst open. A woman stood there, breathing hard as if she had run up several flights of stairs. Her dark hair had slipped partly loose from a clip, and she wore the gray uniform of the building's cleaning staff. One sleeve was damp from cleaning solution. In one hand, she still held a ring of janitor keys that clinked as she moved. For a split second, she didn't see Daniel. Her eyes were locked on Annie. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees, pulling the little girl into her arms. "Annie, what were you thinking?" she said breathlessly. "I told you to stay in the lobby." I looked everywhere. Her words stopped, because Annie turned slightly in her arms and pointed. "He's here." The woman followed her daughter's gesture and saw Daniel Harrington standing across the room. Time stopped. The keys slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a small metallic clatter. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. Maya Johnson. 6 years had passed since he last saw her, but he knew her instantly. The same warm brown eyes, the same quiet strength in the way she held herself. Only now there were new lines at the corners of her eyes. The kind life leaves behind when it demands more from someone than they expected to give. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Daniel's mind filled with images he had buried long ago. A small diner in Brooklyn, rain streaking down the windows, Maya laughing at something he'd said, the smell of coffee and wet pavement, and the night he had walked away because his family told him he had to. Maya slowly stood. Her arm remained protectively around Annie. Her expression changed from relief to something colder. Recognition. "You," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once, almost automatically. "Maya." The sound of her name felt strange in his mouth after so many years. Annie looked up at her mother eagerly. "Mama," I told him, she said. I showed him the picture. Maya's eyes flicked down to the photograph in Daniel's hand. For a moment, something like pain crossed her face. Then she looked back at Daniel. "What did you say to her?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but Daniel heard the tension beneath it. "I didn't know who she was," he answered honestly. Maya gave a short, humorless laugh. "That makes 2 of us." The words hung in the air. Daniel glanced at Annie. "She told me her name," he said quietly. "And yours." Maya's jaw tightened slightly. Annie tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mama." "I told him about the picture under your pillow." Maya's eyes widened slightly. "Annie, it's okay," the girl continued earnestly. "I told him you cry sometimes, but you're still strong." Maya closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Daniel. "I'm sorry," she said. The apology surprised him. "She wasn't supposed to be here," Maya continued. "I had to bring her with me tonight. The babysitter canceled, and I couldn't miss my shift." Daniel glanced at the cleaning cart visible through the hallway door. A slow realization crept through him. "You work here." Maya nodded once. "Night cleaning crew." Daniel felt something twist painfully in his chest. For years, Maya Johnson had been working in the building he owned, walking the same hallways, cleaning the offices, and he had never known. Annie looked between them, confused by the quiet tension. "Mama." "I told him about the picture," she repeated softly. Maya crouched beside her daughter. "You shouldn't have done that, sweetheart, but you always look at it," Annie said. Maya hesitated. Then she gently brushed a curl away from Annie's forehead. "That was a long time ago." Annie frowned slightly. "But he's still him." The simplicity of the statement made Daniel's throat tighten. Maya slowly stood again. She faced Daniel fully now. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from years of working hard without anyone noticing. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel said quietly, "You never told me." Maya's expression hardened. "You never asked." The words struck harder than he expected. Daniel glanced at Annie again. The resemblance was suddenly impossible to ignore. The shape of her eyes, the stubborn tilt of her chin. Something unsettling stirred in his chest. He looked back at Maya. "Is she?" The question caught in his throat. Maya understood anyway. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she said softly, "You left before you could find out." Daniel felt the weight of those words settle over the room. Annie looked up at both of them anxiously. "Mama, am I in trouble?" Maya immediately knelt beside her again. "No, baby," she said gently. "You're not in trouble." Annie looked at Daniel. "I just wanted to ask him." Daniel felt something inside him shift, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Responsibility, regret, hope. He looked at Maya again. "I need to know the truth," he said quietly. Maya held his gaze. "The truth," she said slowly, "is that you walked away 6 years ago." Daniel nodded. "That part I remember." Maya glanced down at Annie, then back at him. "The rest," she said softly, "you'll have to decide if you're ready to hear." Outside the conference room, voices and footsteps filled the hallway as company executives hurried closer. But inside the room, Daniel Harrington felt as if the entire world had narrowed to 3 people standing under fluorescent lights. Maya Johnson stood near the conference table, her hand resting protectively on Annie's shoulder. The room felt smaller than before, as if the past had walked in and closed the walls around them. Daniel Harrington remained standing across from them, tall and composed in his tailored suit. But the calm expression he had perfected over decades of corporate negotiations was beginning to crack. Annie looked up at both adults, sensing the heaviness in the air. "Mama, why are you both so serious?" she asked quietly. Maya forced a small smile and brushed Annie's hair back. "Because grown-ups sometimes carry old stories," she said softly. "Stories that take time to explain." Annie nodded slowly, though it was clear she didn't fully understand. Daniel watched the interaction silently. Something about the way Maya held Annie stirred a memory he had buried long ago, the warmth in her voice, the quiet strength she always carried even when life pressed against her. But now there was something else too. Exhaustion. Years of it. Daniel cleared his throat slightly. "You said earlier," he began carefully, "that I left before I could find out." Maya's eyes returned to him. "Yes." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Then tell me." The words were simple, but Maya heard what they meant. "Tell me what happened after I walked away." For a moment, she didn't respond. Her fingers tightened slightly around Annie's small hand. "You really want to know?" she asked. "Yes." Maya let out a slow breath. "All right." She glanced down at Annie again. "Sweetheart, why don't you sit over there for a minute?" She pointed gently to a chair near the window. Annie obeyed, climbing up quietly and hugging her backpack against her chest. Maya waited until the little girl was settled before turning back to Daniel. Her voice was calm, but beneath the calm was something deeper, pain that had been carried alone for years. "When you left," she began slowly, "I thought it would hurt for a while." Daniel remained silent, but I didn't realize how long a while could be. She folded her arms loosely, leaning slightly against the edge of the conference table. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after you disappeared." Daniel's stomach tightened. "I tried calling," she continued. "Your phone had changed." Daniel looked down briefly. "My family," he said quietly. Maya nodded. "I figured that out eventually." The Harrington family name carried weight across half the financial world. Powerful, careful, protective of their image. A relationship with a black waitress from a small neighborhood diner had never been part of their plan for Daniel. Maya continued. "At first I thought maybe you just needed time." Her eyes flickered toward the photograph on the table. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing he could say. Maya's voice softened slightly as she looked toward Annie. "I almost didn't keep the baby." Daniel's head lifted. "But then, one night," she said, "I realized something." "What?" Maya met his eyes. "That the child hadn't done anything wrong." Annie swung her feet gently from the chair, unaware that her entire life was being summarized in the quiet space of the room. Maya continued speaking. "I moved out of my apartment because I couldn't afford it anymore. My mother helped when she could, but she was already struggling herself. Daniel listened carefully. I worked 2 jobs while I was pregnant, she said, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day. Daniel's chest tightened, and people talked. Maya's mouth curved into a faint, bitter smile. You'd be amazed how much people enjoy gossip. Daniel knew that was true. The whispers started the moment my stomach began to show, she continued. Where's the father? What kind of woman has a child without a husband? Maybe she was trying to trap some rich guy. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Maya noticed. That one was my favorite, she said quietly. Daniel opened his eyes again. I never told them who you were. Why not? He asked. Maya shrugged lightly. What would have been the point? She gestured toward Annie. Every time someone asked, I just said the father wasn't around. Daniel's voice was low. I wasn't. No, Maya said simply. You weren't. Silence filled the room again. Annie's voice suddenly broke through it. Mama? Maya turned immediately. Yes, sweetheart. Were you sad back then? Maya walked over and crouched beside her. Sometimes. Annie thought about that. But you're strong, she said confidently. Maya smiled gently. I had to be. Daniel watched the exchange quietly. Maya stood again and looked back at him. When Annie was born, she said, I thought things might get easier. Her eyes softened slightly. She was such a quiet baby. Annie beamed at that. I was? Yes, Maya said. You hardly cried. Then Maya looked at Daniel again. But raising a child alone is expensive. Daniel nodded slowly. I worked wherever I could. Cleaning crews, grocery stores, office buildings. Eventually, the Harrington Tower cleaning contractor hired her. The irony still made her shake her head sometimes. I've been cleaning offices in your building for almost 2 years, she said. Daniel's jaw tightened, and I didn't even know. No, Maya replied. You didn't. Annie slid down from her chair and walked back to her mother, taking her hand again. Daniel looked at the little girl. And she never asked about me? Maya hesitated. Oh, she asked. Annie nodded. I always asked. Daniel swallowed. What did you tell her? Maya glanced at Annie before answering. I told her father once cared about me very much. Daniel looked down at the photograph again. And that he went away. The quiet honesty in her voice felt heavier than anger. Daniel took a slow breath. Then he looked back at Maya. I can't change what happened, he said. No, Maya replied. You can't. Annie looked between them again. But maybe, she said softly. You can start now. Both adults turned toward her. Daniel studied the little girl carefully. Her eyes were hopeful, curious, unafraid. For the first time since this impossible afternoon had begun, Daniel Harrington felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not fear, not strategy, responsibility. He looked at Maya again. The DNA test, he said quietly. Maya nodded once. Yes. Daniel glanced at Annie again. If the test confirmed what his instincts were beginning to whisper, then everything he thought he understood about his life was about to change. And this time, walking away wouldn't be an option. Daniel Harrington had faced hostile boardrooms before. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers while competitors tried to tear his company apart. He had survived financial crashes, government investigations, and ruthless takeover attempts. But nothing in his carefully constructed world had prepared him for what waited outside the conference room now. Celeste returned first. Her normally composed face was pale. Daniel, she said quietly, you need to see this. She held up her phone. Across the screen flashed a breaking headline from one of the major financial networks. Tech billionaire confronted by child claiming to be his daughter during live press conference. Daniel stared at it. Below the headline was a blurred screenshot from the press conference. Annie standing in front of him, the photograph in her hands, the caption underneath already spinning the narrative. Speculation had begun. Inside the room, Annie tugged on Maya's sleeve. Mama? Are we in trouble? Maya knelt beside her immediately. No, she said softly, but Daniel could hear the tension in her voice. Celeste continued speaking quickly. 3 networks picked up the footage before we cut the broadcast. Social media is exploding. Every business channel in the country is replaying the moment Annie said you were her father. Daniel remained silent. Celeste lowered her voice. The board is furious. Of course they are, Daniel replied. Celeste hesitated. They're demanding a statement within the hour. Daniel looked at Maya. Her face had grown pale, not from fear for herself, from fear for Annie. What kind of statement? Daniel asked. Celeste glanced briefly at Maya and Annie, the one that protects the company. Daniel understood immediately. A denial, a carefully worded rejection. Distance the company from the child. Distance Daniel from the woman. Distance the brand from scandal. Celeste continued, "They want you to say the child is mistaken and that legal counsel will investigate." Maya let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't amused. It was the kind of laugh that comes when someone sees exactly how the world works. Daniel looked at her. "You expected that," he said. "Yes," Maya replied calmly. "Men with empires don't usually welcome surprises." Daniel didn't respond. Celeste shifted uncomfortably. "There's more." Daniel looked at her. "Reporters are already searching for the child's identity. Security footage shows Annie entering the building through the service entrance." Maya stiffened slightly. Celeste hesitated before finishing. "They're asking who she is, and why a cleaning staff employee's daughter was in the executive press floor." The words hung in the air. Annie looked confused. "What's wrong with being a cleaning person?" she asked quietly. Maya squeezed her hand. "Nothing, sweetheart." Daniel's jaw tightened. Celeste continued reluctantly. "The media has already found the employee records." She looked at Maya now. "Your name is circulating." Maya's shoulders straightened slightly. "Of course it is." Celeste lowered her voice further. "They're saying the woman who claims to be connected to Daniel Harrington works as a janitor in his own building." The word landed hard. Janitor. Daniel felt anger flare somewhere deep inside him. But Maya only nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." Annie looked up at her mother. "Mama, are people being mean?" Maya crouched beside her again. "People sometimes say things when they don't understand a story yet." Daniel spoke suddenly. "Where are the reporters now?" Celeste answered immediately. "Downstairs." She glanced toward the door. "And more are arriving." Daniel walked toward the window. From 50 floors above Manhattan, the city looked calm and distant. But down on the street, the media vans were already gathering. Camera lights, satellite trucks, a storm forming. Behind him, Maya spoke quietly. "This is exactly why I never wanted Annie to find you." Daniel turned. Maya met his gaze. "You think the hardest part of raising a child alone was money?" Daniel said nothing. "It wasn't," she continued. "It was protecting her from people who think power makes them better than everyone else." Daniel studied her face. "You think I'm like that?" Maya shrugged slightly. "You're the one who left." Before Daniel could respond, Annie spoke again. "Are they going to yell at Mama?" Her small voice cut through the room. Daniel looked down at her. "No," he said firmly. "They're not." Celeste looked uncertain. "Daniel, the board." "I'll deal with the board." Celeste blinked. "You can't ignore them." "I'm not ignoring them." Daniel walked back toward the conference table. But something about his posture had changed. The man who had entered this room earlier was thinking like a CEO. Now he looked like someone who had just realized the cost of protecting a reputation. "Prepare a statement," he said. Celeste nodded. "What should it say?" Daniel glanced at Annie. The little girl looked very small, standing in the middle of the room. Suddenly he imagined what the cameras downstairs would see. A billionaire denying a child. He looked back at Celeste. "It will say the truth." Celeste frowned. "We don't know the truth yet. We know enough." Maya watched him carefully. Daniel turned to her. "You said you spent years protecting Annie from the world." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then I suppose it's my turn." Celeste's voice rose slightly. "Daniel, if you publicly acknowledge the possibility that she's your daughter, the board will panic." Daniel looked at her calmly. "They already are." The room fell quiet again. Outside the door, the distant noise of reporters continued to grow. Annie tugged on Maya's sleeve once more. "Mama." "Yes." "Is he going to help us?" Maya looked at Daniel. For the first time since entering the room, there was something different in her expression. Not trust, but curiosity. She wanted to see what kind of man he really was now. Daniel met Annie's gaze. "I'm going to try," he said quietly, and for the first time since the press conference began, Annie smiled. The problem was, outside that door waited an entire world ready to tear their story apart. And Daniel Harrington was about to find out whether protecting a company was harder than protecting a child. Daniel Harrington stood in the elevator as it descended toward the lobby. Beside him, Celeste watched the floor numbers drop with growing anxiety. "Daniel, we still have time to change the statement," she said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. His reflection stared back at him from the mirrored elevator walls. For years he had seen the same man there, a controlled, strategic CEO who knew exactly how to protect his company. Today he saw something else. A A man who had just discovered that 6 years of someone's life had happened without him. The elevator doors opened. Noise flooded in immediately. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Mr. Harrington. Daniel, is the child really yours? Are you denying the allegation? Is this a paternity scandal? Reporters surged forward, microphones raised, voices overlapping in a chaotic wall of sound. Security guards struggled to hold the line. Daniel stepped out calmly. Behind him, Celeste whispered urgently, "Stick to the script." Daniel walked toward the podium that had been set up quickly near the lobby entrance. The same building where Annie had walked in earlier that afternoon now felt like the center of a storm. Cameras pointed directly at him. Live broadcasts had already resumed. Millions of viewers were watching. Daniel placed both hands on the podium. The room slowly quieted. "Mr. Y. Harrington," one reporter shouted. "Can you confirm whether the child who interrupted your press conference is your daughter?" Daniel looked directly at the cameras. Then he spoke. "This afternoon," he began steadily, "a young girl named Annie approached me during a press conference." Cameras clicked rapidly. "She believed I might be her father." The reporters leaned forward. Daniel continued, "At this moment, I cannot confirm that." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "But I also will not deny the possibility." The room erupted. Reporters shouted over one another. "Are you acknowledging paternity? Is the mother making legal claims? Is this a lawsuit?" Daniel raised his hand slightly. The room quieted again. "A DNA test will be conducted," he said clearly. "Until then, speculation serves no one, especially not the child involved." A reporter called out from the front row. "Mr. Harrington, sources say the child's mother works in this building as part of the cleaning staff. Is that true?" Daniel paused. In the back of the lobby, he could see Maya standing with Annie beside a security guard. Maya looked tense, but she stood tall. Annie held her hand tightly. Daniel turned back to the reporters. "Yes," he said. The crowd reacted instantly. "So the billionaire CEO had a relationship with a janitor? Is this a workplace scandal?" Daniel's voice hardened slightly. "Maya Johnson is not a janitor. She is an employee who works harder than most people in this building." The room went quiet again. "And if the test confirms Annie is my daughter," Daniel continued, "then Maya Johnson will also be the mother of my child." The cameras flashed even faster. Celeste stood off to the side, stunned. Daniel continued speaking. "No matter what the results show, that little girl deserves privacy and respect." He glanced briefly toward Annie again. She did not ask to become a headline. A reporter raised her voice. "But Mr. Harrington, investors are already questioning your judgment. Some analysts say this could damage your company's reputation." Daniel looked back at her. For the first time, his tone carried a hint of steel. "If the reputation of Harrington Tech cannot survive a 6-year-old girl asking a question, then perhaps it wasn't as strong as we believed." The room went silent again. Even the reporters seemed surprised. Daniel stepped away from the podium. "Thank you," he said simply. Security immediately began guiding reporters back. The conference ended as abruptly as it had begun. Celeste rushed toward him the moment he stepped away. "Daniel, do you have any idea what you just did?" "Yes. The board is going to lose their minds." "They already have?" Across the lobby, Maya stood frozen. She had watched the entire thing. Every word. Annie tugged her hand excitedly. "Mama, he didn't say we were lying." Maya looked down at her daughter. "No," she said quietly. She looked back at Daniel, and for the first time since seeing him again, the anger in her eyes softened slightly. Daniel walked toward them slowly. Maya met him halfway. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Maya said quietly, "You just made your life a lot harder." Daniel nodded. "I know." Annie looked between them. "But you helped us," she said. Daniel looked down at her. "Yes," he said softly. "I did." But as he spoke, Celeste's phone began ringing again. She glanced at the screen. Her expression darkened. "The board meeting just ended," she said. Daniel already knew what was coming. "What did they say?" he asked. Celeste hesitated. "They want you upstairs." Immediately, Daniel exhaled slowly, because the real battle had not been with the reporters. It was waiting 50 floors above them, inside the boardroom of the company he had built, and those men were far less forgiving than the media. The boardroom on the 52nd floor of Harrington Tower had always been Daniel Harrington's battlefield. Long glass windows overlooked Manhattan like silent judges. A polished walnut table stretched across the room, surrounded by 12 leather chairs where the most powerful investors in his company usually sat with calm authority. Tonight, calm was gone. The moment Daniel stepped inside, he felt the tension. Every chair was filled. Richard Hallberg stood at the far end of the table, his silver hair perfectly combed, his thin lips pressed into a line that meant trouble. "Sit down, Daniel," Hallberg said coldly. Daniel closed the door behind him and walked calmly to the empty chair at the center. Celeste remained near the wall, silent but watchful. The board members didn't greet him. They stared. Finally, Hallberg spoke again. "That press conference," he said slowly, "was the most irresponsible public statement I've seen from a CEO in 20 years. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "I answered a question. You legitimized a scandal." Daniel didn't respond. Another board member, Karen Liu, pushed a tablet across the table. "Look at this." Daniel glanced down. Stock charts. The Harrington Tech line was dipping sharply. 4% in the last hour, she said. Another director added sharply, "Financial media is calling it a paternity scandal." Hallberg folded his hands. "Investors are asking if the CEO of this company has secretly fathered a child with a cleaning employee." Daniel's voice remained calm. "And?" Hallberg's patience snapped. "And our reputation is collapsing." The room erupted. "This company depends on stability. You built Harrington Tech on discipline. Now you're risking billions over a random child." Daniel slowly raised his eyes. "She isn't random." The room fell quiet for a moment. Hallberg leaned forward. "You don't even know if she's yours. That's why we're doing a DNA test." Karen Liu shook her head. "That's not the issue." Daniel looked at her. "The issue," she continued, "is perception." Another director spoke sharply. "You should have denied the claim immediately. That would have ended the story." Hallberg nodded. "Instead, you encouraged it." Daniel's voice was steady. "I refuse to call a 6-year-old girl a liar on live television." Silence filled the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hallberg's tone hardened. "You are not thinking like a CEO." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "No," he said. "I'm thinking like a human being." A few directors exchanged uneasy looks. Hallberg was not impressed. "This company is worth $80 billion. Daniel didn't blink. "I know. And the board has a responsibility to protect it." Daniel nodded once. "I know that too." Hallberg stood, then listened carefully. The room went still. "You will issue a second statement tonight." Daniel already knew what was coming. "You will clarify that the woman involved has no confirmed relationship with you." Daniel said nothing. Hallberg continued. "You will confirm that the child's claim is unverified." Daniel remained silent. "And," Hallberg finished, "you will distance yourself from both of them until legal review is complete." The words hung in the air. "Distance yourself." Daniel slowly folded his hands. "And if I don't?" Hallberg's eyes hardened. "Then the board will have to reconsider your position as CEO." Celeste shifted slightly against the wall. That was the nuclear option, removing Daniel Harrington from the company he founded. Karen Liu spoke more gently. "Daniel, we're trying to protect you." Daniel looked at her. "No," he said quietly. "You're trying to protect the stock price." Hallberg's patience evaporated. "You are behaving irrationally." Daniel leaned back in his chair again. "I disagree." Another board member slammed a hand lightly on the table. "Over a child you met 2 hours ago?" Daniel's eyes moved slowly around the room. Then he spoke calmly. "That child walked into a room full of cameras today and asked me a question." Silence returned. "She believed I might be her father." No one interrupted. "And the truth is," Daniel continued, "there is a very real chance she's right." Hallberg scoffed. "That still doesn't make her your responsibility." Daniel's voice hardened. "It might." Hallberg shook his head. "You're willing to gamble this company on a possibility." Daniel stood. For the first time since entering the room, his presence filled it completely. "No," he said quietly. "I'm refusing to gamble a child's life on corporate convenience." The board members stared at him. Hallberg's voice turned icy. "Careful, Daniel." But Daniel didn't back down. "For 6 years," he said, "that girl grew up without a father." No one spoke. "If she's mine," he continued, "I won't make it 7. The room went silent again. Hallberg studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly. "You're making a mistake." Daniel met his gaze. "Maybe." Hallberg picked up a folder from the table. "DNA results will take several days." Daniel nodded. "Until then," Hallberg said quietly, "you have a choice." He slid the folder across the table. "Protect the company or protect that child? Daniel looked down at the folder, then back up at the board. His answer came without hesitation. If she's my daughter, he said calmly, there won't be a choice. Across the room, Celeste exhaled slowly, because every person in that boardroom understood something in that moment. The war had officially begun, and Daniel Harrington had just chosen his side. When Daniel Harrington left the boardroom, the silence in the hallway felt almost surreal. Moments earlier, the room had been full of raised voices, financial threats, and cold calculations about stock prices and public image. Now there was only the quiet hum of the building. Celeste walked beside him. You realize what just happened in there? She said carefully. Daniel pressed the elevator button. Yes, you may have just started a war with your own board. Daniel didn't look worried. They started it. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. They stepped inside. As the doors closed, Celeste studied him. I've worked with you 12 years, she said. I've seen you negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking. Daniel remained silent. But I've never seen you gamble like this. Daniel finally spoke. I'm not gambling. Celeste raised an eyebrow. The board would disagree. Daniel looked at the descending numbers. Because they think the only thing worth protecting is the company. The elevator reached the lobby. When the doors opened, the storm of reporters had moved outside the building behind security barriers. Inside, the lobby had grown quieter, and near the reception desk, Annie sat swinging her legs from a tall chair. Maya stood beside her. The moment Annie saw Daniel, her entire face lit up. You came back. Daniel felt something unfamiliar loosen in his chest. Yes, he said. He walked toward them. Maya watched him carefully. You survived the board meeting, she said. For now. That bad? Daniel gave a small smile. They want me to pretend you and Annie don't exist. Maya didn't look surprised. That sounds about right. Annie frowned. Why would they want that? Daniel crouched down so he was at her eye level. Sometimes adults are afraid of things they can't control. Annie thought about that. Like math tests? Daniel laughed softly. Exactly like math tests. Maya crossed her arms. So what happens now? Daniel stood again. The DNA test. Celeste stepped forward. I already called a private clinic, she said. They can run the test tonight. Maya blinked. Tonight? Daniel nodded. No reason to wait. Annie looked confused. Does it hurt? Maya knelt beside her. No, sweetheart. It's just a little cotton swab inside your cheek. Annie considered that. Okay. Daniel studied her for a moment. You're very brave. She shrugged slightly. I just want to know. Her words were simple, but they hit Daniel harder than anything the board had said upstairs. A few minutes later, they were sitting in the back of Daniel's car as it moved through the evening streets of Manhattan. The city lights reflected across the windows. Annie sat between Maya and Daniel, her small backpack still clutched tightly. For several minutes, she was quiet. Then she looked up at Daniel. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. The question clearly mattered to her. When you left my mama, did you know about me? Daniel's chest tightened. Maya looked away toward the window. Daniel answered honestly. No. Annie studied his face carefully. You promise? I promise. She nodded slowly. Then she asked the second question, the one that broke something inside him. If the test says you're my dad, her voice became very small. Will you leave again? The car went completely silent. Even the driver glanced briefly in the mirror. Maya closed her eyes for a moment. Daniel looked at Annie. He saw the hope in her eyes, but also the fear. 6-year-olds shouldn't have that kind of fear. Daniel felt something shift inside him. For decades, he had been driven by ambition, success, legacy. Now a 6-year-old girl was asking him the one question no business strategy could answer. He spoke quietly. No. Annie blinked. Really? Daniel nodded slowly. If the test says I'm your father. He paused. Then I'm not going anywhere. Annie stared at him for a moment. Then she leaned forward suddenly and wrapped her small arms around him. It was the kind of hug children give without hesitation. Without calculation, Daniel froze for half a second. Then, slowly, he hugged her back. Across from them, Maya watched silently. For the first time since seeing him again, something in her expression softened. Because she realized something important in that moment. Daniel Harrington might still be the same powerful billionaire, but the man holding Annie in his arms right now was not the same man who had walked away 6 years ago. 20 minutes later, the car stopped outside a private medical clinic. The DNA test was about to begin, and with it, the truth Daniel Harrington could no longer avoid. The private medical clinic was quiet when Daniel Harrington's car pulled up. Unlike the chaos outside Harrington Tower, this place felt controlled and calm, soft lighting, polished floors, and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. It was the kind of clinic wealthy clients used when they didn't want reporters asking questions. Annie stepped out of the car first, holding Maya's hand tightly. Daniel followed behind them. Inside, a receptionist was already waiting. "Mr. Harrington," she said politely. "Dr. Keller is expecting you." Celeste had clearly prepared everything. They were escorted into a small examination room where a middle-aged doctor greeted them warmly. "Good evening," he said. "I'm Dr. Keller." He knelt slightly so he could look Annie in the eye. "And you must be Annie." Annie nodded. "Are you the DNA doctor?" Dr. Keller smiled. "You could say that." She thought about that for a moment. "Will it hurt?" "Not at all," he assured her. "All I need is a little swab from inside your cheek." He showed her the cotton stick. Annie looked at Maya. Maya nodded gently. "It's okay." Dr. Keller worked quickly. First Annie, then Daniel. 2 simple swabs placed carefully into sealed tubes. "That's it," the doctor said. Annie blinked. "That was it?" "That was it." She seemed slightly disappointed. "I thought it would be more science." Daniel chuckled softly. "Sometimes the biggest questions have the smallest tests." "Doctor." Keller labeled the samples carefully. "The lab will begin processing immediately," he said. Daniel nodded. "How long?" "Normally 48 hours. Daniel looked at him steadily. "I need the results sooner." Dr. Keller hesitated. Then he understood the situation. "I'll personally oversee it," he said. "You'll have answers tomorrow evening." Maya looked surprised. "Tomorrow?" Daniel simply nodded. The truth was coming faster than either of them expected. They left the clinic a few minutes later. Outside, the night air felt cooler. Annie walked between them again. "So now we wait?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. She seemed thoughtful. "What if the test says you're not my dad?" Daniel paused. It was a fair question. He looked down at her. "Then we'll still make sure you and your mom are okay." Annie smiled slightly. "That sounds fair." Maya studied him quietly. She hadn't expected that answer. Meanwhile, across the city, another conversation was happening. Richard Hallberg sat in his office overlooking Central Park. The television on his wall replayed Daniel's press conference. Again and again. The moment Annie had spoken, the moment Daniel refused to deny her, Hallberg muted the screen. Across from him sat a private investigator. A thick folder rested on the desk. "Tell me everything," Hallberg said. The investigator opened the folder. Maya Johnson, 32 years old, raised in Queens. Hallberg listened silently. Single mother, no criminal record, works night shifts, cleaning office buildings. Hallberg leaned back. "That's it?" "There's more," the investigator said. He flipped a page. Financial struggles. Several late rent payments over the years. Medical debt from Annie's birth. Hallberg's eyes narrowed slightly. "Anything that could damage credibility?" The investigator hesitated. "Nothing illegal." Hallberg tapped his fingers slowly on the desk. "That's unfortunate." He stood and walked to the window. Below him, the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly. "Daniel built this company from nothing," Hallberg said quietly. "And now he's about to risk it for a woman who cleans his floors." The investigator said nothing. Hallberg turned back toward him. "Dig deeper. There's not much else to dig." "Everyone has something," Hallberg said coldly. "Find it." Back in Daniel's car, Annie had fallen asleep against Maya's shoulder. The long day had finally caught up with her. Maya adjusted the small blanket Daniel's driver had given her. "She's exhausted," Maya said softly. Daniel nodded. "Today was a lot." Maya looked at him. "Why did you do it?" Daniel glanced over. "Do what?" "Defend us in front of the press." Daniel thought for a moment. Then he answered honestly, "Because I realized something." "What?" He looked at Annie sleeping peacefully. "For the first time in my life, I might actually have something more important than my company." Maya didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. And somewhere deep inside her, a small wall she had built over 6 difficult years began to crack. Because tomorrow the DNA results would arrive. And when they did, Daniel Harrington's life would change forever. The next morning arrived too quickly. Daniel Harrington had not slept. The lights of Manhattan had faded slowly into gray dawn while he sat in his penthouse office staring at the city below. Normally, his mornings began with reports, meetings, and market analysis. Today, there was only one thing that mattered. The DNA results. His phone sat on the desk beside him. Silent. Daniel checked the time again. 8:12 a.m. Dr. Keller had promised the results by the evening, but Daniel knew how these labs worked. When something involved a man like him, people moved faster. Still nothing. Across the city, in a small apartment in Queens, Maya Johnson was also awake. She sat at the kitchen table watching Annie eat cereal. The little girl was unusually quiet. "Mama?" Annie asked suddenly. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think he's my dad?" Maya hesitated. "I think we'll know soon." Annie nodded slowly. "Do you want him to be?" Maya looked down at her coffee. "That's not the important question." Annie tilted her head. "What is?" Maya reached across the table and touched her daughter's hand. "The important question is whether he will stay if he is." Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. But before Maya could say anything else, her phone vibrated. She picked it up, a message from an unknown number. She opened it and froze. It was a news alert. Tech billionaire scandal deepens. Questions about mother of secret child. Maya's stomach tightened. She tapped the article. The story loaded instantly. The headline alone made her chest tighten. Maya Johnson, cleaning staff employee, linked to billionaire CEO facing questions about her past. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled. The article was full of speculation. Sources claim the woman involved has struggled financially for years. Some analysts suggest the situation could be a calculated attempt to gain access to Harrington's wealth. Questions remain about why the alleged mother waited 6 years before coming forward. Maya felt heat rise in her face. Annie noticed immediately. "Mama, what's wrong?" Maya forced her voice steady. "Nothing, baby." But Annie had already leaned closer. "I can read," she said. Before Maya could stop her, Annie read part of the headline. "Why does it say you want his money?" Maya closed the article quickly. "That's not true. Then why did they write it?" Maya took a slow breath. "Because sometimes people write stories before they know the truth." Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Daniel's phone finally rang. He answered immediately. "Daniel Harrington." "Mr. Harrington, this is Dr. Keller." Daniel stood up instantly. "You have the results." "Yes." Daniel waited. For the first time in years, the silence felt unbearable. But before the doctor could continue, another phone began vibrating on Daniel's desk. Celeste. Daniel ignored it. "Doctor," he said, "tell me." Dr. Keller spoke carefully. "The DNA analysis confirms a biological relationship." Daniel closed his eyes. "There is a 99.98% probability that Annie Johnson is your daughter." The words settled slowly into the room. Daniel exhaled. A strange mixture of emotions rushed through him at once. Shock, relief, regret, and something else, responsibility. "My daughter," he said quietly. "Yes." Daniel opened his eyes again. "Thank you, doctor." When the call ended, Daniel stood silently for several seconds. Then he picked up Celeste's call. "Daniel?" she said urgently. "I just received the results." "I know. They confirmed it?" "Yes." Celeste exhaled. "That changes everything." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." But Celeste's voice suddenly shifted. "There's something else." Daniel frowned. "What?" "Someone leaked a story about Maya." Daniel's expression hardened. "What kind of story?" "Financial problems, old debts. Media outlets are already running headlines, suggesting she planned this." Daniel felt anger rise immediately. "Planned it?" "Yes." Celeste hesitated. "The timing is suspicious." Daniel's voice dropped. "Who started it?" "We don't know yet." But Daniel already had a suspicion. Richard Hallberg. The board wanted distance. If they couldn't control Daniel, they would destroy Maya instead. Daniel picked up his coat. "Where are you going?" Celeste asked. "To see my daughter." He hung up before she could respond. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel Harrington understood something clearly. This was no longer about reputation, or investors, or the board. Someone had just attacked the mother of his child, and Daniel Harrington did not lose wars. Daniel Harrington arrived at Maya's apartment 20 minutes later. He hadn't called ahead. The truth felt too important to deliver over the phone. The small apartment building in Queens looked exactly like thousands of others in the city: brick walls, narrow staircases, the faint smell of coffee drifting from somewhere down the hallway. Daniel climbed the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached the 3rd floor, he hesitated briefly before knocking. Inside the apartment, Maya had just finished helping Annie put on her shoes. The girl still planned to go to school. Life, Maya believed, shouldn't stop because the world was suddenly watching. Then the knock came. Maya opened the door. Anne froze. Daniel stood there, still in his dark suit, his expression serious but different than it had been the day before. More certain. "You got the results," Maya said quietly. Daniel nodded. Annie immediately appeared behind her mother. "Hi." Daniel looked at her, and something in his chest tightened again. "Hi, Annie." She studied his face carefully. "You look like you have big news." Daniel gave a small smile. "You could say that." Maya crossed her arms slightly. "Well?" Daniel stepped inside slowly. Then he said the words that changed everything. The test confirmed it. Silence filled the apartment. Annie blinked. "Confirmed what?" Daniel knelt down so he was eye level with her. "That I'm your dad." For a moment Annie didn't react. Then her entire face lit up. "Really?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Annie threw her arms around him again. "See, Mama, I told you." Daniel hugged her carefully, still amazed by how natural the gesture felt. Across the room, Maya stood very still. 6 years of memories passed through her mind in seconds. Lonely nights, long shifts, whispers from strangers, raising a child without help, and now the man who had once walked away was standing in her living room calling Annie his daughter. Daniel stood again and faced Maya. "It's official." Maya nodded slowly. "I figured." Daniel hesitated. "There's something else." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. "The news story." Daniel nodded. "You saw it." "Yes. Someone leaked information about your finances." Maya laughed bitterly. "They're trying to make me look like a gold digger." Daniel's voice hardened. "They're trying to destroy your credibility." Annie looked confused. "What's credibility?" Maya sighed softly. "It means people trying to say Mama is lying." Annie frowned. "But you're not lying." Daniel knelt beside her again. "No," he said firmly. "She isn't." Annie seemed satisfied with that. Daniel stood and looked back at Maya. "I'm holding a press conference in 1 hour." Maya blinked. "Another one?" "Yes." "What are you going to say?" Daniel met her eyes. "The truth." Annie tugged his sleeve. "Are you going to tell everyone I'm your daughter?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Yes." Annie grinned proudly. "Cool." Maya wasn't smiling. "You realize what happens after that?" she said quietly. "Yes." "You'll make this worse." Daniel shook his head. "No." He glanced down at Annie. "I'm going to end it." 1 hour later, the media storm returned. But this time, Daniel Harrington walked into the press room with absolute certainty. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras pointed directly at the podium. Daniel stepped forward. The room quieted quickly. He spoke clearly. "Yesterday, a young girl named Annie asked me if I was her father." He paused. "The DNA test results arrived this morning." The room held its breath. Daniel continued. "The results confirm that Annie Johnson is my daughter." The room exploded. Cameras flashed nonstop. Reporters shouted questions. Daniel raised his hand. "And there's something else I want to address." The noise slowly died down. This morning, several media outlets published stories attacking Annie's mother. He paused. "Maya Johnson." The cameras turned toward the side of the room where Maya stood quietly holding Annie's hand. Daniel continued speaking. "Maya did not come looking for money. She did not come looking for attention. In fact, she didn't come looking for me at all." The reporters exchanged looks. "It was Annie who came looking for me." Annie waved shyly. A few reporters even smiled. Daniel's voice hardened slightly. "For 6 years, Maya Johnson raised our daughter alone. No help, no support, no recognition." He looked directly at the cameras. "While I built a company." The room grew quiet. "And now," Daniel said slowly, "some people are trying to rewrite that story." He paused. "They're wrong." The silence was heavy. Daniel continued. "Maya Johnson didn't ask for my money. She didn't ask for my name. She simply raised our daughter the best way she could." He looked at Maya, and she did an extraordinary job. For a moment, Maya looked genuinely stunned. Daniel returned his attention to the reporters. "If anyone has a problem with that," he paused, "they can talk to me." Across the room, Celeste watched with quiet amazement, because she realized something. Daniel Harrington had just publicly chosen a side, his daughter and her mother. But high above the city, in a quiet office overlooking Central Park, Richard Hallberg watched the broadcast on television. His face remained cold. "So," he said quietly, "he's chosen the girl." The private investigator sitting across from him nodded. Hallberg leaned back in his chair. "Then it's time to remind Daniel Harrington who actually controls his company." The city had barely finished reacting to Daniel Harrington's announcement when the next battle quietly began. Inside Harrington Tower, the executive floor felt colder than usual. Celeste stood outside Daniel's office, watching 3 board members walk past without even greeting her. They were heading straight to the emergency boardroom. That was never a good sign. Inside his office, Daniel was reviewing a financial report when Celeste entered. "The board just called another meeting," she said. Daniel didn't look up. "I figured. This one doesn't include you." Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. That told him everything. "They're planning something," Celeste added. "They always are." She hesitated. Halberg requested legal counsel and 2 major investors. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. Far below, Manhattan moved like it always did, busy, indifferent, unstoppable. "They're preparing a vote," Celeste said quietly. Daniel nodded. "To remove me." Celeste didn't answer, because it was true. In the boardroom upstairs, Richard Halberg sat at the head of the table like a man preparing to perform surgery. The directors around him looked uneasy. Halberg slid a document across the table. "Daniel Harrington has become a liability." Karen Liu frowned slightly. "That's extreme." "Is it?" Halberg replied. He pointed to the screen behind him where financial news channels were still discussing Daniel's announcement. "His personal decisions are now affecting investor confidence." Another director spoke carefully. "The market stabilized after his second press conference." Halberg's voice turned colder. "For now." He tapped the table. "But what happens next?" No one answered. Halberg continued. "A CEO whose personal life dominates headlines is dangerous for a public company." Karen folded her arms. "Removing the founder could create more damage than the scandal itself." Halberg leaned forward. "Unless we present it as a necessary leadership transition." Silence filled the room. The meaning was clear. Force Daniel out. Control the narrative. Protect the company. Back in Queens, Annie sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures with colored pencils. Daniel sat across from her, trying to understand how a 6-year-old could completely rearrange his priorities in less than 2 days. Annie held up her drawing. "Look." Daniel leaned closer. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands. One had messy curls. One had long hair. One wore a tie. "Is that me?" Daniel asked. "Yes." Annie pointed proudly. "That's Mama. And that's you." Daniel smiled. "You gave me very big hair." "You do have big hair." Maya laughed quietly from the kitchen. Daniel looked up at her. For the first time since this entire situation began, the apartment felt peaceful. Then Annie suddenly remembered something. "Oh." She jumped up and ran to her backpack. Daniel watched curiously. She returned holding a small paper flyer. "What's this?" he asked. "My school science fair." She handed him the flyer. Daniel read it. "PS 214 Science Fair Parent Presentation Night. Friday evening." Annie looked at him hopefully. "Parents, come and see our projects." Daniel glanced at Maya. She said nothing. Annie's voice became softer. "I've never had anyone come before." The words landed gently but painfully. Daniel looked down at the flyer again. Then back at Annie. "What's your project about?" "Stars." "That sounds important." "It is." She hesitated, then asked the question that mattered most. "Would you come?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." Annie's entire face lit up. "Really? Really?" She jumped up and hugged him again. Maya watched quietly. "You realize," she said softly, "this is exactly the kind of thing the board will hate." Daniel shrugged. "They already hate everything else." Maya studied him. "You're risking your company." Daniel looked down at Annie's drawing on the table. 3 figures holding hands. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but some things are worth the risk." Across the city, Richard Halberg received a message from the board's legal counsel. He read it slowly, then smiled. The vote had been scheduled. Within 48 hours, the board would decide whether Daniel Harrington remained CEO. Halberg looked out over the city lights. "Enjoy the science fair," he muttered quietly, "while you still have a company to run." And for the first time since Annie had walked into that press conference, Daniel Harrington was about to discover that being a father might be easier than surviving his own board of directors. The gymnasium of Public School 214 smelled faintly of glue, cardboard, and cafeteria pizza. Rows of folding tables filled the room, each one covered with colorful poster boards, homemade models, and eager elementary school students waiting beside their projects. Parents moved slowly through the aisles, nodding politely, asking questions, and occasionally applauding the more ambitious experiments. At the far end of the room, Annie Johnson stood beside a small display covered with silver paper stars. Her poster read in large handwritten letters, "How Stars Are Born." A cardboard solar system hung above the table, gently spinning from fishing line. Annie kept glancing toward the entrance. Her fingers tapped nervously against the edge of the table. "Relax," Maya said quietly beside her. "I am relaxed," Annie insisted, but she immediately looked back at the door again. Other students' parents had already arrived. A tall father in a construction jacket leaned over to examine a volcano project. Another mother took pictures of her daughter's robot display. Annie tried not to stare. "Maybe he's stuck in traffic," Maya said gently. Annie nodded. "Maybe." Across Manhattan, traffic was not the problem. Daniel Harrington was sitting at the head of another boardroom table, but this time the atmosphere felt even colder than the meeting before. Every director was present, even the ones who rarely attended emergency votes. Richard Hallberg stood slowly. "Let's begin." Daniel sat quietly, hands folded. He already knew why this meeting had been called. Hallberg's voice carried across the room. "This board must decide whether Daniel Harrington remains fit to lead Harrington Tech." A few directors shifted uncomfortably. Karen Liu spoke first. "Richard, we're rushing this." Hallberg didn't look at her. "Investor confidence is declining." Daniel finally spoke. 4%. Hallberg turned toward him. "That's only the beginning." Daniel remained calm. "You're trying to remove me because I acknowledged my daughter." Hallberg's expression hardened. "We're trying to protect a global technology company." Daniel leaned back. "From a 6-year-old girl." Silence filled the room. Hallberg ignored the comment. "The vote will proceed." Karen spoke again. "At least wait until the market stabilizes." Hallberg shook his head. "The damage is already done." He looked directly at Daniel. "You chose this path." Daniel checked the time. "Alta Kurikikipeme." The science fair had started at 6. Hallberg noticed. "Busy evening?" Daniel stood. "I have somewhere to be." Hallberg laughed softly. "You're leaving during a removal vote?" Daniel walked toward the door. "Yes." Hallberg's voice followed him. "You're choosing a child's school project over your company." Daniel stopped briefly. Without turning around, he said calmly, "If you have to ask that question, you'll never understand the answer." Then he walked out. 40 minutes later, the doors of the school gymnasium opened. Annie looked up instantly, and there he was, still wearing his suit, still slightly out of breath, but smiling. "You made it," Annie shouted. Daniel walked across the gym floor toward her. "I said I would." Several parents nearby began whispering immediately. Some recognized him. One mother whispered to another, "Is that Daniel Harrington?" But Annie didn't care about any of that. She grabbed his hand and pulled him to the table. "Come see my stars." Daniel crouched beside her display. "This is impressive." Annie pointed proudly at her poster. "Stars are born when gas clouds collapse from gravity." Daniel nodded seriously. "That sounds complicated." "It is." She looked at him carefully. "You really came." Daniel met her eyes. "Of course." Across the room, Maya watched quietly. Something about the moment felt bigger than she expected. Because for Annie, this wasn't about science. It was about finally having someone show up. Annie looked around proudly. Then she whispered to Daniel, "You're the only dad wearing a suit." Daniel smiled. "I came straight from work." She tilted her head. Was work important? Daniel thought about the boardroom, the vote, the company he built. Then he looked back at Annie's spinning cardboard stars. "Not tonight," he said. Meanwhile, in the Harrington Tower boardroom, Richard Hallberg finished counting the votes. He leaned back slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "it seems Mr. Harrington has made this very easy." The board had spoken, and Daniel Harrington no longer knew it yet, but the company he built was no longer his to run. The gymnasium of public school 214 buzzed with excitement. Parents moved from table to table, smiling politely as children explained volcano eruptions, homemade robots, and solar system models made from painted foam balls. At the far end of the room, Annie Johnson stood proudly beside her display of silver stars. Daniel Harrington crouched beside her, studying the poster carefully as if it were the most important presentation he had attended all week. "So stars are born when gravity pulls gas clouds together?" he asked. Annie nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. And then nuclear fusion starts." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "That sounds like something my engineers would enjoy hearing." Annie grinned. "I told you it was complicated." Behind them, Maya watched quietly, leaning against the wall near the bleachers. She had expected this evening to feel awkward, but instead it felt strangely normal. For the first time in Annie's life, she had someone standing beside her project who looked exactly like the other parents in the room. Annie suddenly grabbed Daniel's sleeve. "Oh, my teacher." A woman in her early 40s approached, holding a clipboard. "Annie," she said warmly, "are you ready to present your project?" Annie nodded eagerly. "Yes." Then she turned proudly toward Daniel. "And this is my dad." The words hung in the air for a moment. Daniel felt something shift deep inside his chest. Not the sharp surprise he had felt 2 days ago. This time it felt natural. The teacher smiled politely and extended her hand. "I'm Mrs. Harper." Daniel shook it. "Daniel Harrington." Her eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Oh." She glanced briefly at Annie, then back at him. "Well, Annie has been very excited about tonight." Annie beamed. "I told you he would come." Mrs. Harper looked at Daniel again. "You must be very proud." Daniel looked down at Annie's spinning cardboard stars. "I am." Annie immediately launched into her presentation. "So stars are made from giant clouds of gas called nebulae." Daniel listened carefully, but part of his attention drifted toward the door of the gymnasium. His phone had vibrated twice in his pocket. He ignored it. Annie pointed to one of the diagrams. "And when gravity pulls everything together, the center gets really hot." Mrs. Harper nodded approvingly. "That's excellent research." Daniel felt his phone vibrate again, more urgently this time. He glanced down briefly. "Celeste." 3 missed calls, and a message. "Call me immediately." The vote happened. Daniel already knew what it meant, but he didn't move. Annie was still explaining her poster, and then the star starts shining. Mrs. Harper clapped lightly. "Wonderful job, Annie." Annie looked up at Daniel anxiously. "Did I explain it right?" Daniel smiled. "You explained it perfectly." She sighed with relief. "Good." Across the room, Maya noticed Daniel finally checking his phone. She could read his expression instantly. Something had happened. When Annie turned back to rearrange her model planets, Maya walked quietly toward him. "What is it?" she asked softly. Daniel showed her the message. Celeste had sent another one. The board voted. Halberg pushed it through. Maya read it slowly. "You've been removed." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The words should have felt heavier, but strangely, they didn't. Inside the gymnasium, children laughed, parents chatted, and Annie proudly explained her star chart to another student. Maya looked at Daniel carefully. "You just lost your company." Daniel glanced toward Annie. "No," he said quietly. "I lost a title." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "And I gained something else." Across the room, Annie suddenly called out, "Dad." Daniel looked up immediately. "Come see this." He walked back toward her. Annie pointed excitedly at the spinning solar system. "I fixed the orbit." Daniel crouched beside her again. "Looks stable." Annie grinned proudly. Behind them, Maya watched silently, and for the first time since that chaotic press conference, she understood something clearly. Daniel Harrington might have just lost control of the company he built, but somehow, he had finally found the life he was supposed to be living. Meanwhile, 40 floors above Manhattan, Richard Halberg sat alone in the Harrington Tower boardroom. The official vote document lay in front of him. CEO removal approved. Halberg leaned back slowly. "Enjoy your science fair," he muttered. "Because tomorrow." He glanced out at the city lights. "The real consequences begin." The next morning felt strangely quiet. For the first time in over 20 years, Daniel Harrington woke up without a company waiting for him. No early investor calls, no market reports, no emergency strategy meetings, just sunlight slipping through the curtains of his penthouse and the distant hum of New York City waking up below. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, letting the reality settle. Yesterday, he had been the CEO of an $80 billion technology empire. Today, he wasn't. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A dozen notifications, financial news alerts, board announcements, headlines. Harrington Tech Board removes founder as CEO. Investors back Halberg's decision. Scandal continues to shake tech giant. Daniel read the headlines calmly. Then he placed the phone face down. Across the city, Annie Johnson was already awake. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring a picture of stars while Maya made pancakes in the kitchen. The doorbell rang. Annie jumped up. "I'll get it." She opened the door and grinned instantly. "Dad." Daniel stood there holding a small white bakery box. "I brought breakfast." Annie stepped aside dramatically. "Come in." Daniel entered the apartment. still wearing a casual jacket instead of his usual suit. Maya looked up from the stove. "You're early." Daniel placed the bakery box on the table. "Croissants." Annie gasped. "Fancy breakfast." Maya folded her arms. "You don't have work today?" Daniel met her eyes. "No." She raised an eyebrow. "Because you're taking a day off." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Because I don't have a company anymore." Annie looked up from the table. "You lost it?" Daniel crouched beside her. "The board decided someone else should run it." Annie thought about that for a moment. "Did you get fired?" Daniel smiled faintly. "That's one way to say it." Annie didn't look upset. Instead, she seemed curious. "So, what do you do now?" Daniel leaned back against the chair. For most people, the question would have sounded frightening. For him, it felt strangely open. "I'm not sure yet." Annie's eyes lit up. "Oh, you could come to school more." Maya almost laughed. Daniel chuckled. "That's one idea." Annie grabbed her backpack and pulled out another drawing. "I made this last night." Daniel studied it. It showed 3 people again, but this time there was a telescope. "What's this?" "Our new plan." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "New plan?" "Yes." She pointed at the drawing proudly. "You help me study space." Maya leaned against the counter. "That's ambitious." Annie nodded seriously. "I want to be an astronaut." Daniel looked at the drawing again. A billionaire tech founder who had just lost his empire, being recruited as a space research assistant by a 6-year-old. He smiled. "I think I could handle that job." Annie looked satisfied. But then she asked something unexpected. "Are you sad?" Daniel paused. The question was simple, but honest. He looked around the small apartment. Maya cooking pancakes. Annie coloring stars. Morning sunlight across the kitchen table. Then he answered truthfully. "No." Annie blinked. "Really?" Daniel nodded. "For the first time in a long time, I'm exactly where I want to be." Across the room, Maya watched him carefully, and she realized something surprising. Daniel Harrington had not lost everything. He had simply walked away from the wrong life. But miles away, in a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, Richard Hallberg stood in Daniel's former office. The chair behind the desk was empty. Hallberg placed his hand on the polished wood. "Effective immediately," he said to the executives beside him. "We begin restructuring leadership." One of them hesitated. "What about Harrington?" Hallberg smiled slightly. "He's no longer a problem." But Hallberg didn't know something yet, because Daniel Harrington might have lost his title, but the man who built Harrington Tech from nothing had never truly needed a title to win. And the next move in this war was already beginning. The idea came from a 6-year-old. Daniel Harrington didn't realize it at first. That morning had begun quietly in Maya's small apartment. Pancakes, croissants, spilled orange juice, and Annie proudly explaining the difference between red giants and neutron stars, like a miniature professor. For the first time in decades, Daniel had nowhere else to be. No boardroom, no investors, no empire demanding his attention. Just a small kitchen table and a little girl with a telescope-shaped drawing. Annie was now sitting on the living room floor surrounded by paper and crayons. Daniel leaned against the couch watching her work. "What are you building now?" he asked. Annie didn't look up. "A company." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A company?" "Yes." She held up the drawing. It showed a building with rockets painted on the side. On top of the building were large letters. "Star Lab." Daniel smiled. "What does Star Lab do?" Annie explained very seriously. "We help kids learn about space." Maya glanced over from the kitchen. "That sounds expensive." Annie shook her head. "No, it's not." She pointed at the drawing. "You just need computers and telescopes and smart people." Daniel chuckled softly. "Is that all?" "Yes." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You know computers." Daniel nodded. "I do. And Mama says you build things." "Sometimes." Annie tapped the paper with her pencil. "Then you can build this." Daniel looked at the drawing more carefully. It was simple, childlike, but the idea behind it stirred something in his mind. Space, education, technology, a network where kids could study the stars using real data. Something open, something global, something bigger than just another profit-driven company. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Tell me more about Star Lab." Annie happily continued. "Kids everywhere can look at stars. Not just rich kids." Daniel noticed Maya watching quietly now. Annie added proudly, "And you can make it free." Daniel slowly sat back. For 20 years, he had built tools used by governments and corporations, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity platforms, massive technology systems designed for profit. But Annie's idea was something else. Pure curiosity. Pure discovery. He suddenly remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. Why he loved technology in the first place. Not power. Not money. But the idea that knowledge should belong to everyone. Maya broke the silence. You're thinking very hard. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Annie tilted her head. Is Star Lab a good idea? Daniel looked down at her drawing again. Yes, he said quietly. It's a very good idea. Across Manhattan, inside Harrington Tower, Richard Hallberg was holding his own meeting. Executives filled the boardroom again. Effective immediately, Hallberg said. We begin restructuring the company. A financial officer spoke cautiously. There's already market speculation about Daniel Harrington starting a competitor. Hallberg laughed softly. With what? Another executive added. He still owns several patents. Hallberg waved dismissively. Patents don't build companies. He leaned back confidently. Daniel Harrington is finished. Back in Queens, Annie finished coloring the final rocket on her poster. Then she handed the drawing to Daniel proudly. For your new company. Daniel studied it for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window. The New York skyline stretched endlessly in front of him. Somewhere in that skyline stood Harrington Tower. The company he had built, the empire he had lost. But now a new idea was forming. Something Hallberg could never imagine. Daniel turned back toward Annie. What if Star Lab wasn't just a drawing? Annie's eyes widened. You mean real? Daniel nodded. Very real. Maya crossed her arms. You just lost an $80 billion company yesterday. Daniel smiled slightly. That means I finally have time to build something better. Annie jumped up. Star Lab is real. Daniel laughed. Yes. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Celeste. Several senior engineers from Harrington Tech just resigned. They want to meet you. Daniel read the message slowly. Then he smiled, because Hallberg had made one very big mistake. He thought Daniel Harrington was dangerous only as a CEO, but the most dangerous version of Daniel was the one with nothing left to lose. The meeting happened at night, not in a glass tower, not in a boardroom, but in a quiet diner in Queens that smelled like burnt coffee and grilled onions. Daniel Harrington sat in a corner booth, wearing a simple jacket instead of the expensive suits the world was used to seeing. Across the table sat 5 engineers. Every one of them had resigned from Harrington Tech that morning. Celeste had arranged the meeting. She sat beside Daniel, arms folded, watching the room carefully. The waitress poured coffee into chipped white mugs. None of them touched it. Finally, one of the engineers spoke. His name was Victor Alvarez, a senior systems architect who had been with Daniel almost from the beginning. You really left, Victor said. Daniel shrugged slightly. They helped. Another engineer laughed quietly. Hallberg thinks the company belongs to him now. Daniel leaned back. For now. A younger engineer, Priya Patel, leaned forward. We didn't come here to talk about Hallberg. Daniel looked at her. Then why did you come? Priya slid a small tablet across the table. On the screen was Annie's drawing, the one Daniel had photographed earlier that day. At the top, written in purple crayon, Star Lab. Daniel smiled slightly. You saw that already? Priya nodded. Celeste showed us. Victor looked around the table. We heard your plan. Daniel corrected him gently. It wasn't my plan. He tapped the tablet. It was Annie's. One of the engineers chuckled. A 6-year-old just designed the future of education. Daniel looked around the table. What if she did? Silence settled over the booth. Priya spoke first. You're serious? Daniel nodded. Imagine a global platform where students can explore real astronomical data. Victor's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Access to telescopes. AI analysis tools. Education systems. Daniel continued. Open access. No corporate gatekeeping. Another engineer leaned forward. You'd need serious infrastructure. Daniel nodded again. I know. Victor looked around the table slowly. Then he smiled. You already have the team. Across Manhattan, inside the executive office of Harrington Tower, Richard Hallberg was enjoying the quiet. Daniel's desk had already been cleared. The framed photos were gone. The office looked larger without them. Hallberg sat in the CEO chair, spinning slightly. One of the board members entered. Richard. There's something you should see. Hallberg looked up. What now? The board member placed a tablet on the desk. An article had just appeared online. The headline read, 5 senior Harrington Tech engineers resign in same day. Hallberg frowned. Coincidence. The board member shook his head. There's more. He scrolled down. 2 more resignations came in 10 minutes ago. Halberg's smile faded. That's unusual. Then the board member said something that made the room very quiet. They're meeting with Daniel Harrington. Halberg stood slowly. That's impossible. He was seen in Queens tonight. Halberg walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. The skyline glittered in the darkness. For the first time since the board vote, something felt wrong. Back in the diner, Victor leaned across the table. You know what Halberg's biggest mistake was? Daniel looked at him. What? Victor grinned. He thought the company was the building. Priya added calmly, but the company was always the people. Daniel looked around the table. 5 engineers, brilliant minds, loyal not to money, but to the man who had built something with them from nothing. Daniel folded Annie's drawing carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. So, Victor said, when do we start? Daniel smiled. Tomorrow morning. Across the city, Richard Halberg stared out the window and slowly realized something terrifying. Daniel Harrington wasn't rebuilding a company. He was rebuilding an army, and this time, it wasn't about money. It was about legacy. The first office of Star Lab was not impressive. It was a small rented workspace above an old bookstore in Queens. The carpet was worn, the desks didn't match, and the internet router had to be restarted twice every morning. But inside that little room, something powerful was beginning. Daniel Harrington stood by the window watching his new team unpack equipment. Victor was setting up a temporary server rack against the wall. Priya had already covered an entire whiteboard with architecture diagrams. Celeste walked in carrying coffee for everyone. Not exactly Harrington Tower, she said. Daniel smiled. Better. Victor laughed from across the room. At least no board members. Priya tapped the whiteboard. Focus, people. She pointed to the diagram. If we want global access, we'll need 3 layers. Victor nodded. Data ingestion from observatories. Celeste added. Cloud distribution. Daniel finished the thought. And an AI interface simple enough for a 10-year-old to use. Priya crossed her arms. Or a 6-year-old. Everyone smiled. Because Annie had become something unexpected. The inspiration. Back in Maya's apartment, Annie sat at the kitchen table doing homework. Maya watched her carefully. You've been very busy lately. Annie nodded. I'm helping Dad build Star Lab. Maya raised an eyebrow. Are you now? Annie pointed to her notebook. I'm designing the kids' part. Maya leaned closer. What's the kids' part? Annie spoke like a tiny CEO. No boring science words. Maya laughed. That's actually brilliant. Later that evening, Daniel arrived. Annie ran to the door. Dad, I made something. She pulled him toward the table. Her notebook was filled with drawings. Cartoon planets, buttons labeled Explore the Stars, and a little mascot shaped like a telescope. Daniel studied the pages carefully. These are interface designs. Annie nodded proudly. For kids. Daniel sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at Maya. She just solved our biggest problem. Maya folded her arms. What problem? Making science exciting instead of intimidating. Across the country, something unexpected was happening. Victor had posted a short message online that afternoon. Not a press release, not a corporate announcement, just a simple sentence. Building something new for the next generation. Stay curious. Underneath it, he had posted Annie's drawing of Star Lab. Within hours, the post began spreading. Teachers shared it. Parents shared it. Astronomy clubs shared it. And slowly, quietly, people began asking the same question. What is Star Lab? By midnight, the post had been viewed more than 2 million times. Back in Harrington Tower, Richard Halberg sat at his desk reading the reports. An assistant entered nervously. Sir, there's something trending online. Halberg looked irritated. What now? The assistant placed a tablet on the desk. Halberg read the headline. Former Harrington engineers build new education project. He frowned. Then he saw the image attached to the article. A child's drawing. A small building. Rockets on the roof. And the words, Star Lab. Halberg laughed dismissively. A children's project. But the assistant didn't laugh. There's more. She scrolled down. Astronomy departments from 3 universities have offered support. Halberg's smile faded slightly, and NASA's public education office reposted the image. The room went quiet. Halberg stared at the drawing again. This time longer. Back in Queens, Daniel sat on the couch while Annie leaned against his shoulder. She was half asleep. Dad? Yes. Are lots of kids going to see the stars? Daniel looked at her small drawing still on the table. Yes, he said softly. I think they will. Annie smiled sleepily. Good. Within minutes, she was asleep. Daniel carefully carried her to her room. Maya watched from the doorway. You just started something big, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked down at Annie, sleeping peacefully. She did. And across the country, millions of people were beginning to discover the name Star Lab. The launch of Star Lab did not happen in a skyscraper. There was no champagne, no luxury stage, no billion-dollar investors applauding from velvet chairs. Instead, it began in a public school gymnasium in Queens, the same gym where Annie Johnson had once stood beside a cardboard model of the solar system. 6 months had passed since that night. 6 months since a 6-year-old girl had walked into a press conference and changed the life of a billionaire. Now the gymnasium was filled again, but this time it was not just students and parents. Teachers, journalists, astronomers, and thousands of viewers watching the live stream online. At the center of the room stood a large projection screen displaying a simple logo. Star Lab. Daniel Harrington stood near the stage adjusting the microphone. He was wearing a plain blazer instead of the tailored suits he used to wear as CEO. Victor checked the live connection. Priya monitored the servers from a laptop. Celeste stood beside Daniel holding a tablet. 10 million viewers, she said quietly. Daniel blinked. Already, Celeste nodded. And climbing. Across the gym, Annie sat in the front row, swinging her feet nervously. Maya sat beside her. You started all this, Maya whispered. Annie shook her head quickly. No, I didn't. Maya smiled. You absolutely did. The lights dimmed slightly. Daniel stepped onto the stage. The room fell quiet. For a moment, he simply looked at the crowd. 6 months ago, he had stood in a room full of investors defending his reputation. Tonight, he stood in front of children, and somehow the moment felt much bigger. Daniel spoke calmly. 6 months ago, a little girl asked me a question. He paused. Why can't every kid study the stars? The screen behind him lit up. Images appeared. Telescopes in Chile, observatories in Arizona, satellite data feeds, real astronomical data streaming across the interface. Daniel continued. Tonight, Star Lab opens access to students across the world. The audience leaned forward. Any child, any school, any country. The interface appeared on the screen. Simple buttons, colorful icons, exactly like the drawings Annie had made in her notebook. Students can explore real space data, Daniel explained. They can study galaxies, track asteroids, even analyze signals from deep space. The gym erupted in applause. Victor whispered to Celeste. The servers are holding. Celeste nodded. Barely. Daniel smiled slightly. And now, he said, I want to introduce the person who actually started this idea. Annie froze in her chair. Maya nudged her gently. That's you. Annie shook her head, but Daniel was already walking toward her. Annie, he said softly, come here. The crowd watched as the small 6-year-old walked slowly onto the stage. She looked out at the sea of faces nervously. Daniel knelt beside her. Do you remember your science fair? Annie nodded. Yes. Daniel pointed at the screen. Star Lab started with your drawing. Annie looked up at the giant logo. Her eyes widened. All those kids can see stars? Daniel smiled. Yes. The audience applauded again. Across the country, classrooms were already logging in. A school in Ohio, a library in Texas, a small rural classroom in Montana. Children began exploring galaxies on their screens. Meanwhile, inside Harrington Tower, Richard Hallberg watched the live stream from his office. The news headline below the video read, Starlab Education Network launches nationwide. Hallberg turned the sound off, but the image on the screen said everything. Millions of students joining the platform, universities offering partnerships, even NASA publicly supporting the program. One of his executives entered the room quietly. Sir, investors are asking why we aren't involved in this project. Hallberg said nothing, because he finally understood something. When he forced Daniel Harrington out of Harrington Tech, he hadn't removed a competitor. He had created something far more powerful. Back in the gymnasium, Annie looked up at Daniel. Dad? Yes? Do you think the stars can see us? Daniel thought about the question carefully. Then he smiled. I think they've been watching for a long time. Annie squeezed his hand. Good. The camera zoomed out as children across the world explored the sky through Star Lab. Daniel looked at Maya. She smiled quietly. Everything had changed. He had lost a company, lost a title, lost the empire he spent 20 years building. But in the end, a 6-year-old girl had given him something far more important. a family, a purpose, and a legacy that would belong to millions of children looking up at the stars. For the first time in his life, Daniel Harrington finally understood something simple. Success was never about building the biggest company. It was about building something that mattered. And sometimes, the smallest voice in the room could change the entire universe. The story of Daniel and Annie reminds us that success is not defined by wealth, power, or titles. For many years, Daniel believed that building a powerful company was the most important goal in life. But when Annie appeared and called him Dad, his priorities began to change. Through her innocence and courage, she helped him realize that true legacy is not what we build for ourselves, but what we build for others. The story teaches that it is never too late to choose responsibility, to correct past mistakes, and to show up for the people who need us most. In the end, love, family, and giving opportunities to the next generation matter far more than any business empire. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.